For this tutorial, you'll be needing some bezels. We're working with solid back bezels, and we're also going to work with a couple of different designs in the open back bezels. So you'll need bezels. You'll also need a little bit of rubbing alcohol to clean the bezels and some Q-tips. Then we'll be working with crystal clay, which is an epoxy clay, and we'll be working with the white. Then we will be rubber stamping onto the crystal clay using these great little rubber stamps, and it stays on ink. You'll need a Nunn Design resin kit with the stir sticks and the measuring cups, and you will need to have some casting craft opaque pigments. We'll be using the white, the blue, and the red to create this lavender color of resin. The Nunn Design bezels, these are cast in lead-free pewter and then they're plated with copper. These three here are also cast in lead-free pewter and plated copper. These are brass with a brass jump ring soldered on with lead-free solder, and then these are also plated copper. Before we start to embed the crystal clay or resin into or onto the bezels, we're going to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol to clean them thoroughly. The Nunn Design products are plated in an electroform process, and then they're oxidized to give them this aged-like look. The oxidization absorbs into the precious metals and kind of gives it this dull look, but there's often a lot of excess of the oxidization in the piece, and so we just want to remove that thoroughly before we go ahead and apply the crystal clay or the resin. I'm also removing any of the oils or dirt that can be on the piece. Once you have used the rubbing alcohol, go ahead and just wipe down. I'm just kind of making sure that the surface is all clean. Alright, now that our bezels are clean, we can go ahead and move on to the next step. Before we can use these two bezels here, we'll need to put a little bit of packing tape on the back side so that we can put the crystal clay in there and there'll be a firm back for the back side. I'm using a U-line set S447, and I'm going to go ahead and peel off a small amount of this tape. And the tape is, you want to look for an area where there's not any mottling, because you can see this in the reflection of the tape. There's like these little bits that sometimes form in the tape. Some tapes have it, some tapes don't. I can have a whole roll of this tape and not have it happen, and in some rolls I do. So I'm just always looking out for that little mottling and then choosing to put my bezel in a place that does not have that. When I remove this tape from the back side of it, that mottling will show up in my clay and in my resin. So I'm just making sure that I have an area that doesn't have it. So place your bezels down onto the tape, and then we're going to press down firmly. I'm keeping my fingers away from the actual center part of the tape. I'm burnishing the bezel down by pressing it, and this is adhering all surfaces of that bezel onto the tape. Once it's burnished, I like to trim away all of this excess tape because it's easy to get this stuck on my hands, on my shirt, on my cat, whatever. So I try to always trim these down first within this step. Alright, so now that we have these two bezels with the back and these two bezels, and all of them are cleaned using rubbing alcohol, we're ready to start with the next step, and that is going to be mixing the crystal clay. Crystal clay comes in two different size packaging. It comes in a 50-gram pack and a 25-gram pack. Just go ahead and open up your package. Inside of the package you'll have some gloves and you'll have some crystal clay. You'll also have a little applicator with a little beeswax on a tip on the top, and that is for embedding chatons and such into the clay. We won't be working with that for this project. Next I'm going to go ahead and open up and take the gloves out and the crystal clay. This is part B, the hardener, and this is part A, the resin. And when these are in their loose form and they're not yet combined together, it's always the best idea to wear the gloves. But when these two are mixed together and they're activated, you have 90 to 120 minutes to work with it, and it is okay to take off the gloves because the resin then is neutralized and you can work with it without the gloves on. Go ahead and open up the package of both of the clays. Before I work with this clay, I'm going to go ahead and put another piece of paper on my surface. I'm going to use a little bit of baby powder to put on my hands before I put the gloves on. This will make it easy for me to take my gloves on and off, and I can reuse my gloves over and over again. So this will make it super easy for me to pull these off by just pulling on the fingers, and then the whole glove can come out and I can reuse this over once I have wiped down all of the crystal clay off of the gloves. The gloves that are in the package are a little bit big for my fingers, so I tend to like to use another type of latex, but these are the ones that come in the package. For mixing the crystal clay, I'm going to put a little bag down on my work surface so that I can pinch off a small ball and then place it onto the plastic there. So I'm going to start out with a small blueberry sized ball of the crystal clay part A. Put that on my work surface, and then I got a little bit of that A. I just want to keep these clays separate so that they don't get activated and harden. And I had some, the A was pretty sticky, so I went ahead and wiped down my gloves just in case I had some still in my glove. So I have a part A and part B. I have too much of the B, so I'm going to put a little bit of it back. So I'm looking for two equal sized balls. It doesn't have to be exact, but it needs to be fairly close. So that's pretty darn close. Once you get into production, you can actually weigh these and make it an exact measurement, and that will speed up your production time. Alright, so I have my two balls of clay, and I'm going to go ahead and blend these together. See, this is where these gloves are just too big. See, my fingers are like too small, so it's hard to blend this clay using these gloves. You can also use, there's a really nice latex glove that I like. It makes it super easy to work with the clay. So you have 128 minutes to work with the clay, so you don't need to be in too much of a hurry. So blend your clay together until it's no longer marbled and is blended completely together. Alright, so once this is mixed together and is activated, we can now take off our gloves. Before I do that, I'm going to wipe them down, just removing any of the crystal clay that might have gotten onto the gloves so that I can reuse these gloves over and over again. Before I handle the crystal clay, I'm going to go ahead and remove the baby powder from my hands and my fingers so it doesn't get into the clay. Alright, so with clean and pretty dry hands, go ahead and pick up the crystal clay. And I like to roll this right into a nice ball, just double checking that I have it so it's not marbled in any way. And now we're ready to start embedding it into the bezels. Once I've pulled off my equal sized balls and I'm ready to mix or have mixed, I want to make sure that I go ahead and close up my container of the crystal clay and pressing out any air that might be in there. It came in a single little bag like this, but when I pack it back up, I like to keep these part A and part B completely separated. So I'm going to seal the A, and take out all that air in there, seal the air out of there, and A is in a bag by itself. And then close up and seal the second bag, and you can use like this bag, this one can go inside of this bag. And then this can go in there too. So now you have your crystal clay ready for the next time, and you're preventing it from prematurely hardening or whatever happens to it. Move this crystal clay up. I'm going to start with a small ball, and I'm going to want to have this clay be nice and flush in the surface for when I rubber stamp onto it. So to start, you can either, I like to do a little trick, and I'll show you. I can pat this down kind of flat and then create like a point like this, and that makes it really easy to get down into this corner of the bezel. Now that I have that down inside of there, I can tell immediately that I'm going to be very short on my crystal clay inside of this bezel. So I can either pull this out and add some crystal clay. So let's just go ahead and do this. This is why it's really nice to make sure that your bezel is nice and clean, so that when you pull that out, you're not removing any of that oxidization. So I'll go ahead and just make a really big ball, and I'll show you what happens when you have too much. So now I have the crystal clay. I can pat this down. You can see that it starts to pick up fibers, like I had some fibers on my hands from those wet wipes and whatnot. And we will be covering that up with the colorized resin shortly. So if your clay is really sticky, this is really sticky right now. If your clay is really sticky when you first mix the clay, you can wait 10, 20 minutes even as this starts to set up a little bit, and then it makes it much easier for you to handle this and work with it. But I have a tendency to not just stick it in the bezel and start pressing down, because it makes all of these side edges much more difficult to clean up. So I'll start with that one little area, and I'm pulling this clay this way, and I'm pushing with my thumb in this kind of motion to move the clay up into the bezel. And as I get closer to this top part, and I'll be able to tell, like, oh man, I have way too much clay here, because I'm just trying to get this nice and flat like that. I can go ahead and pinch off a little excess and continue to pat down. So if I still didn't pinch off enough, I can go back in and remove it. So let me just see, and I'll show you. So I'm going to want this whole surface to be nice and flat. You can see I have a little bit of a bump right there, so I can either pinch this off or disperse it back down and keep everything nice and even. But I'm going to go ahead and pinch off. So here's an example. If you have too much clay, you can just pinch off a little bit, and then you continue to pat this down until it's nice and smooth. So like I said, you know, once you really want to start moving into more production pieces, you can actually figure out like how much clay is that, and weigh the bezel before, and lay the bezel with the clay, and then you'll know exactly what size or weight that you'll need with the bezel to fill the bezel with the crystal clay. Because I must admit, it's kind of a drag going back and forth, pinching off excess. And over time, you know, I've just developed an eye. I can see when I probably have enough. I just have a sense. All right, so now our crystal clay is in there and it's nice and flat. So that's going to be great for when we're going to be rubber stamping on this. Some of the things I'm looking out for now is, you know, do I have the clay? Are there any gaps around these side edges? I'm just wanting to make sure that it's nice and even, so I have a nice clean edge on the sides. So I'll push that in, get that clay down in there. Alright, so that's good for this tutorial. Then your next step is going to be taking a wet wipe, and you can go in either with your fingernail underneath the wet wipe and kind of go along that side edge and just clean up that area. I'm going to put this down for a second and wipe. I have a little bit of crystal clay on my fingers, so I don't want to put that back on the bezel. If you don't have any fingernails, you can use also a toothpick underneath this wet wipe to kind of go into these areas. And then if you have a lot of fingerprints, you can use the wet wipe itself to kind of make a nice smooth surface. You can also just wet a little bit on your finger with, so I have some fibers in there. I gotta tell you, that's just gonna happen. So you can see I have a nice smooth surface. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and next, we might not get to this one. We will probably have enough clay, but I'll get to this one so you can see how we're gonna apply this onto the back of a open back bezel using the remaining clay. So with the remaining clay, I'm gonna go ahead and make that into a nice round ball. So the areas that you're going to really want to focus on this is pushing that clay up into this cup, this and this, these two areas. If you don't, there'll be like a little hole in the back when you flip this over and when it flips over when you're wearing it. So to do that, the same way we started out with the point here, you can flatten it out slightly and then create a little point, and that's going to jam up into that one little area up inside there. You'll also need to have a toothpick at the handy because we're going to put this in here and kind of pat it down. So I'm patting it down and pulling it into that corner, and at the same time I'm pressing up from underneath to give it stability. these fingers are pulling the clay so that I can kind of have it be somewhat equal proportion. So this section right here, we're going to want to use a clean, I don't have one, a clean toothpick. We're going to go up into this area and press it down inside of there just to make sure that the clay is up and in this little area, because it is kind of challenging, and I'll show you. Let's see. If you don't, there will be a little air pocket kind of like right there. It's not that big of a deal, but if we can prevent it, let's just go ahead and try. This will also be true for when you're mixing resin and pouring it in. There's always this little corner, just underneath there, attached to the tape. There's just a little air pocket that forms. Alright, so I'm going to want this to be very level so that when I rubber stamp it, it has a nice even surface and it's not concave down inside of there. So I'm pulling a little bit of that clay back before I continue on. As I come over into this corner and I can see, you know, that I'm going to have some excess, I can pull off a little of that. I can add it back in if I need to, but just to finish this off in this corner, pulled it off. Now I'm using these fingers to support it on the back side and using this finger to push it up into that little corner. Let's see if we need to use the toothpick. It doesn't look like, oh, you can see, can you see that little pocket? It's kind of just down in there versus, so it just depends on how precise you want to be with this. Alright, that looks pretty good. So go ahead and pat it down, hopefully having a nice smooth surface. The same as this bezel. If you had too much, you can pinch some off, but you want to have it to be nice and, see how that's nice and flat and level. Then once you have it nice and flat and level, you can take your wet wipe and just clean away any of the crystal clay that got onto the bezel itself. So making sure that if I had any fingerprints, I can wipe those away too. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead, and while this crystal clay is still wet, we're going to rubber stamp onto the pieces. You're going to need to have decided on what kind of design you would like to use onto your crystal clay, and you'll want to decide, there's lots of different colors of inks that you could use too. We have on our website the black, we also have a white color, and we have a gold color. So for this particular one, I'm going to use the black. Go ahead and open up your crystal clay, not your crystal clay, go ahead and open up your rubber stamp StazOn ink, and I like to test mine first to make sure that it's not dried out, that I have a nice clean stamp when I press down, it's nice and even and clean. So that's what we're looking for before we even stamp this. So when I'm rubber stamping, I often will actually stamp on the side edges of the metal too. So for example, you can see there that I've stamped also on the side edge. So one of the nice things about rubber stamping directly onto the clay is if I don't like it, I can remove it by either using some rubbing alcohol or a wet wipe and wipe it down, or I can also pinch off any crystal clay that had some ink still on it, and I can try again. Just gonna go ahead and test it one more time before I stamp that. Looks good. I'm kind of looking at where my design is on the stamp, and if that's going to be, you know, what do I want that slightly over or slightly this way, and then I'm going to press down very lightly and kind of just roll that onto my clay. So I can see that I could have pressed a little firmer down there, but I like that look. I can actually even come back in and put a little more, just double checking, part of my ink isn't getting on a section of my stamp here. All right, that looks good. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and try again. This time I'm gonna come over a little bit farther over here, maybe down a little bit, so I can put a little more ink right there. So you kind of get an idea of the look of that. All right. I'm gonna get down here, I'm gonna check it out, like where is that going to, the design gonna go, so I can put multiple stamps on there. So we have one, and I'm like, oh, I just so that doesn't work for me, I don't like that at all. So what you will do is you can either take a wet wipe and immediately just remove it from the surface. Now that I have that nice and clean, you know, you can go ahead and just rubber stamp it again until you get a design that you like. All right, so now that I've got these two rubber stamped, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up my work area, just removing any of that ink from the stamp itself. Just helps prolong the life the rubber stamp. And then for storage purposes, I recommend that you store these face down like that. It keeps the ink onto the surface of the pad. Before we mix our Nunn Design resin, I like to place a little bit of tape onto, like these are some business cards that I have. And I like to place the tape onto the business card, so when I'm working with the resin and it overfills, or if it overflows, it's easy for me to remove the resin without picking up any of this paper from the cards. So I am always placing tapes down onto my cards or cleaning up my cards. It also makes it really easy for me to move these cards around and not disturb the resin. So just place the tape over the surface of the card. I like to have that nice and smooth, and then you can trim away the excess off the edges. Just go ahead and prepare yourself some cards. I need 2 for this project, so I got 1. All right, so now that I have the 2 cards, I can place my pieces onto the cards, and I am now ready to mix and colorize the Nunn Design resin. Go ahead and powder fully your hands. I just did mine over my waste paper basket. Just put powder all over my hands. It makes it easy for me to get my gloves on and off, and I can reuse these same gloves over and over again. To mix the resin, you have to have a 1-to-1 ratio exactly of 1 tablespoon to 1 tablespoon. And you have to mix the full cup in order for the resin to be properly activated. So you want to fill up to the first 1 tablespoon, always with the part A, and then up to the second tablespoon, always with the part B. So I like to get down right next to my resin. So put it down on your work surface, nice covered area, and you're going to pour in the part A. Go ahead and take the lid off. Then get right down next to the resin so you can see that line and know exactly when you've hit it. So I'm pouring, and my bottle is tilted quite a bit up so that I can have a heavy flow because I'm putting a lot of resin in. And then as it starts to get close to that line, I'm putting the base of the bottle down closer to the table, and I'm waiting till I get right to that line. So I'll have a very thin flow, and as I hit that mark right where it's at, I'll go ahead and twist the top, and I'll use one of my wet wipes to wipe away any resin that might have spilled. And so I have a nice clean top. I'm going to put my resin top back on. Go ahead and turn that corner over where that resin was, and you're ready to pour the part B. So we're going to do this one up to that 2 tablespoon mark of the part B. So bring it right down to the surface. Pour, pour, pour. It gets right to that line. And as it starts to get to that line, I'm twisting my top, ending the flow, and I'm right at that 2 tablespoon mark. Go ahead and wipe away the excess resin that might be on there. Put the lid on. Now we're ready to time ourselves for 2 minutes. So I have my timer set for 2 minutes, and I'll go ahead and start. And with one of the stir sticks, I'm holding at the base of the resin. I'm putting the stir stick into the resin, and this is a really full cup. So I'm just going slow, and you'll start by rotating around the outside edges. You can see that the 2 parts get cloudy right away as they start to activate and come together. So I'm going around the outside edges. I'm also scraping the bottom of the cup. And then every now and then I'm going to stop, pause, scrape the sides off to get all of that resin of part A and B back into the cup, and then come back in, stirring. You can also rotate it around with your fingers, holding it at the base. Stop and scrape the sides. Scrape the stick back into the cup and keep going. So it's a minimum of 2 minutes, but what you're really watching out for is as these 2 parts, A and B, become more and more mixed, they will get less cloudy. Don't worry too much about those bubbles inside of there because those we'll have ways to deal with. So scraping the sides and the bottom. Scraping into the cup. And there's my timer, but I'm not as clear as I'd like, so I'm going to keep on going. And then at the 10-minute mark, or at the 2-minute mark, or when it starts to get nice and clear like this, we'll be ready.
Sorry.
So with my stir stick, I like to either place it into a cup so that I don't have a lot of resin getting on my surface, or I can also put another piece of plastic down so I don't have any resin getting on the surface. So you can go ahead and let that sit for a couple of moments and let all of those bubbles rise to the surface. And as you can see, they're starting to pop. But as they rise, they'll expand. The air will expand and they will pop. After your timer goes off, and if you still don't have a nice clear mixture, just continue to stir, rotating the cup, stirring, scraping the sides. And then as it starts to get very clear, go ahead and scrape off the top, on the top part, mixing stick. And then I like to place mine into either a cup or onto another piece of plastic and let that dry, because I can reuse that stick over and over again. And as the resin sits, it'll start to have the air bubbles come to the surface, and they'll expand and pop. You can also place this under a nice lamp, and the heat of the lamp will also make the bubbles pop. Alright, I have already mixed up a full cup of the resin, and now I'm going to colorize it using the Casting Craft opaque pigments. And I'm going to be following a formula from the Pantone cheat sheet to make this lavender color. So this formula is in a nice tidy version on our website, but I'm using a tiny toothpick, blue, a tiny toothpick, and then a toothpick and a toothpick. So let me show you what that looks like. Before I go ahead and colorize this, I'm going to be making this formula based off of a 1 teaspoon ratio to these tiny toothpicks. So I'm going to pour off a small amount into this cup, the teaspoon size portion. All right, so I have 1 teaspoon worth of the resin inside of there. I'm gonna set that aside for another project I'm gonna be working on. And I'm gonna be following this formula. So the first one is, it calls for a tiny toothpick, and let me just show you what that looks like. I opened up my colorants and I'm just slightly squeezing it to bring it a little bit up to the surface. A tiny toothpick is really tiny, I'm telling you. This is really potent stuff. I'm going to keep this toothpick on the go right here on the ready, so that if I need to add more, I can do that. It's much easier to add some than it is for me to have to dilute it. So tiny toothpick of red. So you can see I have a tiny toothpick worth there. Keep my toothpick separate, and then actually that was supposed to be a toothpick worth, not a tiny toothpick. So it's 1 tiny toothpick and 1 toothpick worth. Let me show you what a toothpick worth. So we put a tiny bit in. Let me just add to that. Bringing that up to the surface. All right, have some there. So a tiny toothpick is a little bit more. Excuse me, a toothpick is a little bit more. Tiny toothpick was that dot. This is a little bit more. So I'm gonna put that in. I might have too much red, but we'll see. All right, and then the last one it calls for is 1 toothpick of white. And so this is like a toothpick of white. That's what the red should have been too. So let's see how we did, because we might be a little bit off. Right, so then with a stir stick, you can use either the big one like this that we mix the resin with, or a smaller one like this. I'm going to use the smaller one. And go in and blend this together. And as we thought, put way too much. I have to put a little bit too much red in there. Super pretty color though. All right, so I'm gonna go back in and add, I think, a little bit more blue and maybe a little bit more white. And that's pretty much what it took. It just took a little dot more of that blue. All right, so you can continue to mess with that if you want to make sure it's nice and exact. If you want a bigger batch than what we just made here, you would just double the or triple the portions of the resin and then triple these in order to do a larger batch. After you added the colorants, make sure to put the lids back on and put the right colors on the right ones. And now we're ready to add the colorant onto the piece. Alright, so we have the pieces. We put them onto a piece of cardstock so that we can easily move these around, and there's plastic or tape onto the cardstock. Just in case there's overflow, it's easy to peel that off without ripping up the paper and having to remove that. Now I'm going to go ahead and just, I use these multiple times, so I'm going to cut that part off and just use the other side of it. And what you want to do, just make sure that I'm all stirred up here, I'm pretty sure we are. You'll want to just drizzle a small amount onto the crystal clay. And at first we're just going to see, you know, how are we doing? Can we still see that image underneath as we move that around? If your colorants are way too opaque, you put too much white in. So you can dilute that slightly if you'd like. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see a little bit better of what exactly I'm doing here. And I am going to add a little bit more now that I know that that colorant was a good amount. And I'm going to, I like to keep my fingers away from the resin that I'm working on, and I kind of use two toothpicks. One is to control how I'm touching or moving this around, and the other one is used to smear the resin around. So now I'm just dragging the resin over to the side edges. And the resin just wants to know where that edge is, and then it'll stop. Move some of that resin up from the bottom there, up here. So I kind of like that modeling look. And so if you have too much resin on here and you want to pick some of this up, modeling meaning, I'll show you the actual sample of it. But before I get to that step, let me just show you. First I'm going to just kind of come in here closer so I can see really well. And I'm going to drag the resin all the way over to the side edge, consistently all the way around, just to make sure that I don't have any gaps. Meaning that there's some resin on the edge and some resin not. This just makes it nice and consistent. All right, so I like when there's modeling on the piece. Let me show you. It's quite a bit different. But that is caused by two things. One is that the crystal clay might not have been completely level, which I really like. But if you want to have more of a look like that, what you can do is come on in, and I just take my toothpick and I just roll some of that resin up and off of there so that I don't have quite as much as I had, and that's what gives it kind of that mottled sort of look. More resin over here, you can move it over there, but kind of just lightened it up slightly. Kind of gives it more of an interesting look. All right, I'm going to go on to the next one. So on this, I have a choice of leaving this cavity up here empty, or I can fill it with resin as well. And for the sake of this one, I'm going to go ahead and fill it, just so I can kind of go over that with you. So you're going to drizzle a drop or two down into this base part, just a tiny bit to start. And you're going to want to use your toothpick to go over into especially these corners and along the edge down in the base, because air stores really easily down there and it creates these little pockets. So there's kind of like a, when we take that tape off, if you don't do this step, there'll be like little pockets of, like an air pocket in there. And once you have that in the base, you can come back in and drizzle a little bit more, bringing that up to a level surface. So go slow, drizzle, you can always add more. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and cover up the bottom part. Place a little bit onto the base of the clay. And then use your toothpick. So you can choose to be really careful if you want to on this, and just go on this edge right here, right where the clay is, and keep this resin just on the clay versus pulling it all the way out to the sides, which is, so I'm keeping it just on the base of the clay. But if you would like to, you can go ahead and just pour it over all and pull it with your toothpick, which is what I would prefer because I had some that rubber stamping on the side edge, and I think it looks better if it's all the way over to the edge. Had some sort of fiber or something in there. And drizzle a little bit more into the top part. So that kind of gives you an idea. Same sort of thing. You can see that the clay was a little bit higher in this area than it was in others. So this is a little more white. Pick up some of the excess if you don't want it to be so covered. And there you have your second piece. All right, I have one more piece in this series. I'm going to do it up here. I don't have any tape on this, but I filled a little bit of crystal clay into one of the bezels, just because I know that if I poured this into this bezel without and just had it a solid color, I'd have a totally different look. It would be a solid color like this versus this white. I didn't put any rubber stamping on this one. I just wanted to see, I just want a kind of a little accent that I can add, like a little dangle off the side. So I filled this with crystal clay. I like this because it has more of a ceramic look. In the samples that I showed in the very beginning, I did rubber stamp these and made a pair of earrings, but this one I just wanted to have it be plain. So I drizzled a little bit of the colorant on that, and now I can go back over and double check that it's pulled all the way to the edge and nice and neat, and then that will cure as well. While these pieces are curing, you'll want to babysit them to make sure that there isn't any air bubbles in the resin. And how you do that is you'll just keep an eye on them. If you see any kind of air bubbles rising to the surface, you can either take your toothpick and move it around, but you can also use your hot breath. So I'm going to move this off of the camera and I'm going to huff on it with my hot breath, and if there is any air bubbles on there, it will dissipate. But do you remember how we talked about, don't worry about if it's kind of blurred. You can see that when it added on the resin, it just is a nice effect. You can't really see that level of of detail. And this looks like there's something right there in the resin, or, so I'm going to go ahead, and there's some stuff happening right here. So I'm just going to breathe on these and you can see what happens. So you can see that it just dissipates those air bubbles. I'm not sure what that is, but let's just poke at it. And now you'll let these cure. These will be hard to the touch starting at 12 hours, and then will continue to cure for another 72. These pieces have now cured. Pretty cool. I think they turned out really fun. I like them. Alright, so I didn't have any overflow, but if you did have any overflow, just let it go off to the sides. And then after like 12 hours, this will be fairly firm to the edge, to the touch, and you can come in with a pair of needle nose pliers, and then you just bend back the overflow resin and it'll peel right off that edge. It's a beautiful thing. So here's how this little charm accent came out. That's exactly what I was wanting. So I can just add that as a little accent onto this piece if I wanted to, or I could make a pair of earrings to match this. Then also we have this piece ready, and we can go ahead and take the tape off and clean the base of it. For cleaning this, I'm going to put down a piece of plastic, and I peel the tape away from the cured crystal clay, and there's often like little gooiness, a little stickiness from the tape on the back side. You can use the tape to lift that tape back up, that gooiness back up, but I don't find this to be all that great of a solution. So what I highly recommend is using this product called the Goo Gone. Just squirt a small bit onto the back side. And the instructions say to, I think it says to wait like 3 minutes or so, and then it kind of activates and sets up. Once you've waited about 3 minutes, and come on in here, I'm using a little stir stick. You can just come on in, and you see how just, if there was any sticky gooeys on the back of that, it just comes right up. I love this stuff. It's got a nice citrus smell. All right. Once that's cleaned up, I just take a wet wipe. You can just wipe that right off. So when we were doing this, you know, I showed you that this area right here was a little bit higher, and I actually pulled off some of the resin because I liked that white showing through right there. So that's how these pieces came out. Super fun.